This is Russell Dobler here with Keaton Weiss and our guest Lee Fong, who has been dropping a lot of tweets, kind of designed to shoot at every bottle on every tree stump of every ideology. So we actually covered this on election night. Completely agree with Elon that Democrats have widely censored, but if the last year has shown us anything, the Republicans will more than happily censor anything critical of Israel and smear anyone who speaks out as an anti-Semite or terrorist. Now, you got a little pushback on this, and I just want to point out some developments since you tweeted this. There was much rejoicing that Trump, seemingly under pressure from his base, announced that he wouldn't appoint Mike Pompeo to his cabinet, and yet he did appoint Zionist maniac, Russophobic, very pro-Ukraine war supporter, Elise Stefanik. The choice of Stefanik signals a more combative U.S. posture toward the UN. Stefanik has frequently criticized the international organization, particularly over its criticism of Israel, this CNN, and last month said the Biden administration should consider a complete reassessment of U.S. funding for the UN if the Palestinian Authority continues to pursue a push to revoke Israel's UN membership. Now, let's remember, she was also a leading figure in the persecution of the college deans who refused to stop protests on their campuses or to define them as de facto anti-Semitism. So what does this say about the real commitment to freedom of speech? I have no doubt you're going to be able to gender people any way you want under a Trump regime. But what does this mean for pro-Palestine protests? Are they going to support that kind of speech?
I think this is a question where the answer is still up in the air. There are very powerful neoconservative voices still in the orbit of Trump world. Stefanik being appointed or will be appointed to the UN is a great example of this. These folks do not care about free speech. They will host a congressional hearing about the need for free speech. And actually, Stefanik's a good example of this. If you look back, she's on this congressional committee that deals with higher education. If you look back 6 months before October 7th of last year, she's hosting these hearings about the crisis of free speech on college campuses. You can't you can't speak your mind on college campuses. We need more free speech on college campuses. The moment after October 7th, she's bringing in these university presidents, berating them by exaggerating and inventing claims that there were chants around killing Jewish students and demands for a second Holocaust, and demanding censorship, demanding that there be a crackdown on pro-Palestinian advocacy, and these student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine would be kicked off campus or disciplined in some way. So complete reversal once there's an emergency. Of course, many supporters of free speech are fair weather supporters on both the left and right. It's easy to support it when you're looking at censors at the other side of the aisle. It's harder to support it when it's your own team doing it. That being said, there are still a lot of interesting figures in Trump world that even if they, I think there's a principled support of free speech. They kind of realize the basic fundamental value. Some of these folks from the kind of San Francisco podcast VC world that do have an ear in the Trump world. Vivek Ramaswamy, also, I think, very principled on free speech. He's still in the orbit. Tulsi Gabbard, David Sachs. That's what kind of makes the Trump world very interesting, because there is a very active push and pull. Someone who's influential one day could be pushed out the next. We'll see what the future holds, but on issues around Israel, I'm not holding my breath. The major Republican super PAC donors to the Trump campaign were people who are very hawkish on Israel. Miriam Adelson, Paul Singer, several others that are just very pro-Israel. So, I think it's TBD, but likely to be a very centrist pro-Israel administration.
I mean, this Israel issue seems to be one where like values seem to go out the window. There seems to be an Israel exception for so many of these people. I mean, if you look at a guy like RFK Jr., he made, a very central pillar to his campaign when he ran as a Democrat and then as an independent prior to dropping out was free speech. And yet when Bill Ackman's, tweeting out how these university, presidents have to go, RFK, he's retweeting Bill Ackman. Like it just goes out the window. Seems to be the one issue that across the board, even people who you look to as being very principled in other areas seem to have an exception. And so, look, I mean, Stefanik, she's UN ambassador. She's not going to be in a position to censor speech, but it is reflective of a certain value set.
Yeah,
especially,
he's throwing a bone to Miriam there.
Right, exactly. And that's not going to be the first one. That's not going to be the only one, right? I mean, that's the way you kind of have to look at that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, here's the kind of rub. I mean, there's a lot of focus on X and on Twitter as a platform, but it looks like TikTok and Facebook have been censoring pro-Palestinian speech at a much higher degree. That's on the basic kind of evidence that we see. And I did a story earlier this year. There's a former Israeli intelligence-backed NGO called Cyberwell that works with all the other kind of anti-disinformation, anti-hate speech NGOs that work kind of in the back end to enact these content moderation and censorship demands on the big platforms. The big question is, as the Trump administration gets in, they're going to try to clean house at the State Department, at the DHS, and other agencies that have brought in these NGOs and kind of given them, if not government financial backing, kind of the credibility backing to pressure these platforms. There's going to be a very new dynamic, I think, with with Elon Musk and others who are a little bit more opposed to these dynamics. And it's a big question of whether the pro-Israel groups can shoehorn themselves in to continue censoring, because there's government censorship, there's private sector censorship, but then there's also kind of this mix where these NGOs and governments collaborate. And I think
that was the Twitter files, right?
Right.
No, that's right.
All right. So you got into a little bit about the swing of men. Now, I think we were all surprised that men swung GOP, with the Democrats being so charming to this constituency over the last few years. How could they possibly have turned on them? And you point out some really interesting things in this article about the suicide rate of young men now being 3.8 times higher than for young women. That women are going to college in the millions above men. So that for a lot of young men, the idea that they're enjoying more privilege is really not making a whole lot of sense. So you're right. The left-leaning press has derided the shift as merely the rise of toxic masculinity and the hatred of women's rights. The New York Times described something even more sinister, calling it creeping hegemonic masculinity. I don't know where they come up with these phrases. This reflexive contempt, it's like they hired Don Draper to repel voters. This reflexive contempt may unintentionally provide an explanation for the reversal. Many young men believe they live in a liberal-leaning society that actively despises them, treating them with disdain rather than empathy as their struggles have mounted. And you link to Trump's kind of closing pitch, which I hadn't seen, but it's quite fascinating. So we'll take a quick look at that.
4 years ago, we took a wrong turn and lost our purpose. We lost the strength that makes Americans who we are. If we dared to speak the truth, it was called hate speech, and our values were labeled shameful. That's when everything we care about fell apart. We surrendered our borders, our paychecks, and our courage. Our patriotism was called toxic. Men could beat up women and win medals, but there was no prize for the guy who got up every day to do his job. Now we're being asked to settle for the way things are. And we're wondering if America can make a comeback. We can, because we've done it before. When we get knocked down, we don't stay down, we get up again. We fight, we fight, we fight.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Okay, now, why do you think that pitch was so effective?
I think there's a lot of stewing resentment in society. Some of it, that's it's its own separate discussion. But as I point out in the article, there are fairly rational reasons for men to feel abandoned in our current culture. That there are material declines in terms of how young men are doing. They're more addicted. They're gravitating to violence at much higher rates. They're getting addicted to drugs and alcohol and online gambling. Their suicide rate is skyrocketing. And as you mentioned, that I cite in the article, they look around, they look to their female colleagues if they're teenagers or in their early 20s. They don't see the disparities that people, even millennials or Gen X or boomers, saw when they were growing up, when there was a bigger disparity where men were better off financially in terms of education. It's really flipped. In a lot of white collar professional jobs, women are making more, especially in the big cities. They're certainly going to college more. So for the dominant liberal ideology to lecture to men that you're the oppressor, you're the problem in society, you're at the top of the food chain, and you need to kind of sacrifice your privilege, it doesn't make sense. And for Trump to harness the resentment that some men feel from this ideology, I don't know if it's the only explanation, but I think it's a big part of it, why there's a 30-point swing from young men traditionally supporting the Democratic ticket to a majority supporting Trump this election.
Well, I also think, a lot of the jobs that are being either, automated out of existence, exported overseas, or replaced by labor being imported into the United States. These are, those are jobs that are disproportionately occupied by men without a college degree. Driving jobs, transportation jobs, manufacturing jobs, warehouse jobs. And even if even in cases where they haven't been automated out of existence, or they haven't been exported, or they're not being undermined by an influx of immigrant labor, just the general degradation of working class life in America, such that wages have not kept up with inflation. If you look at real wages, they're actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. That hits men without a college degree the hardest, and that creates a status drain, and that creates a self-esteem drain, and it creates opportunities for what are basically lifestyle influencers to present themselves as political actors, right? Live a certain way as a means of political expression. It's kind of the flip side of the woke sort of influencer sphere on the lib side. And it's especially powerful when you're running on an economic program like Trump's, which offers very little in the way of actual empowerment. But part of harnessing that resentment, part of getting people riled up emotionally, is making the kind of pitch that you saw in that video. It works. I mean, there's a reason they do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of how Trump will deliver on these promises to young men, that's remaining very elusive. It's not clear how he's going to deliver, but it's clear that he really harnessed some true anger and disaffection from the dominant culture. And I point out in the article that I think it's worth repeating that there were unforced errors from the Kamala campaign that kind of reinforced this resentment. And I think part of it is this Joe Rogan phenomenon and it wasn't just Joe Rogan. Trump went on many different podcasts and even streamer shows that are popular with young men. And we've seen a really just gravitational change in the way that young men consume media. There is no more dominant television or even magazine space that men can go to. Young men like transgressive content. They've got hormones and energy, and they want to see things that question the dominant kind of orthodoxy. It used to be, if you were a young man, there were a lot of spaces for that. You could watch, stand-up comics. You could read Vice. There's lots of kind of edgy content. That, those kind of outlets have been smashed. They have become, liberal clickbait, or they've kind of turned into circular firing squads and been diminished. They've been replaced by.
Yeah, you mentioned how Vice used to be like an edgy outlet, and it became, liberal clickbait.
Yeah, and it destroyed itself. It's literally bankrupt now because it's lost its appeal. When it tried to, it literally went back and added trigger warnings to 30 years of their articles, and people justifiably said, "What is this? This is not what I signed up for when I started reading Vice." And so, if you want transgressive content, yeah, you're going to go to places like Joe Rogan, which has over 11 million listeners per week. During the election, I think it was over 50 million. For these episodes, this episode with Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, and there's been these campaigns by liberal activists, people associated, if not literally, but figuratively, with the Democratic Party, to cancel Joe Rogan, to get him removed from YouTube, get him removed from Spotify, and for Kamala Harris to kind of refuse to go in and sit for the 3-hour traditional interview. For I think a lot of young men, that is an implicit endorsement of the cancel culture campaigns they've seen since their youth. It's too icky to go on someone like Joe Rogan's podcast. He must be so terrible. She must agree with those people all throughout the left that want to cancel him. I think that's what that was the dog whistle that the Harris campaign was sending.
I think also watching that ad, I have always felt that a big flaw in the whole liberal project is the idea that you're going to sell a country whose core self-image, whatever the truth is, its core self-image, the core American myth, is very built around Rocky kind of stories, right? The underdog who gets up and fights, and it's a story that is inherently oriented around the idea of agency and true grit and stick-to-itiveness. Again, whatever you believe about the reality of that is our core story about ourselves. That's why those films are so popular in America. That's why we created that genre. The idea that you're going to sell people on a valorization of victimhood, in the end, that was bound to run smack against something like the Trump phenomena that was going to go to more traditional American ideas and images. And of course, because the soil is so much more amenable to that way of looking at ourselves, and really the liberal project is, even as it intones the words empowerment, it's a very disempowering vision. The idea that you're a victim of circumstances that you can't escape, and the only way to solve social problems is to coddle and orient society around everyone's victimhood.
No, I think you're touching on something very important here. And, when this article was published a day or two ago, and I did some tweets kind of promoting it and on a similar theme, people, of course, responded and said, I support toxic masculinity or, rape culture or something. That's not what I'm talking about. And I think this gets to a core problem in leftism, or certain types of the liberal coalition, is that there are different forms of masculinity. There's a form of masculinity that is toxic and violent and abusive. No, there's no question about that, and that is a big problem. But for the Kamala campaign, only attacking that form of masculinity and not talking about the more positive version that is supported in ads like that from Trump, that talks about protection, traditional values, standing up and providing for family and core kind of family-oriented masculinity. That we don't have to politicize that. That's not necessarily Democratic or Republican. These are popular values that are an opportunity for either party. And for whatever reason, the Democrats over the last decade have rejected this form of masculinity to their own detriment.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to whether you're talking about culture stuff or more economic based stuff. They just are a party that feels like demographics are destiny, and the diversification of America means the bluing of America. And as long as that trend continues, we don't have to say anything. Like, we don't have to say anything. Did the Kamala Harris campaign issue a statement about this? Did they project any? Did they signify anything at all? Don't forget, when Kamala was asked, should trans Americans have access to gender affirming care, she was asked that in a very blanket sense. She wasn't asked about children. She wasn't asked about sports. She was very basic. Basically a question of, should trans people exist in America, right? Should gender affirming care be a thing? She reverts to, well, I think we should follow the law. Like, she wouldn't even answer that question. They won't answer anything. They don't want to take a position on anything. They want to sit atop the social hierarchy and let the demographics just take them where they feel they are entitled to go. They don't want to seek out a position on anything at all, it seems to me.
Well, part of this goes back to something I wrote about right after Kamala officially kind of was taking the nomination, where there's no other competitors, and she was getting coronated, last summer. And, you look at her history, the main consulting firm that advised her when she ran statewide for AG and then for Senate and advised her presidential campaign. This is a firm. It's changed names several times. It used to be called Bear Star Strategies. The candidates they've advised in the Bay Area, Gavin Newsom, many of the top Democrats in California, this is kind of their MO. They don't provide a policy page. They don't talk about any policy specifics. They pander to certain kind of coalition groups within the Democratic Party, and then they elevate extreme aspects of the right. Gavin Newsom basically has selected the last two candidates that he's run against for governor by kind of meddling in the Republican Party and getting kind of a Tea Party Trump-esque character nominated, knowing that, okay, I don't actually have to campaign against this person because they're so extreme, the California electorate will reject them. I don't actually have to stand for anything. I don't have to provide a real governing philosophy or particular viewpoint on any of these hot button issues. I'm just kind of trying to box the other side in as being so extreme, and then take no serious policy positions, so I don't have anything to defend. It's not just Gavin Newsom. Several of these other Democrats, one of Kamala's aides, won Barbara Lee's seat this cycle, open seat in the East Bay representing Oakland and Berkeley, Latifah Simon. She went the whole year without even having a policy page. She didn't even bother until the last week of the campaign to put up a policy page. It's really the exact same playbook.
It's branding.
Yeah, it's branding. It's, you look at her campaign ads, she kind of she walks past murals of the Black Panthers and kind of gestures towards the civil rights era and kind of uses symbols to represent progressive reform. But in terms of policy, there's nothing.
All right, let's get to our last segment before we have to switch over to Rumble. So you, right out of the gate,